The Association of the United States Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Noon Report webinar series. This webinar series features presentations by senior Army leaders responsible for key programs and initiatives. The webinar series also features contemporary military authors who weave together the past, present, and future story of the United States Army. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Membership and Meetings, Brigadier General Retired Jack Haley.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Noon Report. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We are very excited to be broadcasting to you live from our new AUSA studio, and we appreciate your support as partners in the defense of our nation. Joining us today to discuss his book is General Stanley McChrystal, U.S. Army retired, author of Risk, A User's Guide. You can buy the book by clicking on the pop-up that will appear periodically throughout the event. Please take advantage of having General McChrystal here to ask questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. After the discussion, we will take as many questions as possible. You can also find his full bio in the Handouts tab. We're also very pleased to have with us today AUSA's Senior Fellow, General David Perkins, U.S. Army retired, who will moderate the discussion. General Perkins, over to you.
Well, thanks. It's a pleasure and honor for me today to introduce today's speaker and author, a man who really needs no introduction, General Stanley McChrystal, former commander of U.S. and international forces in Afghanistan, and before that, our Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. As he's transitioned into retirement, he's established a McChrystal group that does leader development for a myriad of organizations. He teaches at Yale and has authored many books, and today he's going to speak to us about his newest book on risk. General McChrystal.
Well, Dave, thanks to you and AUSA for having me today, and for everybody for taking the time to join. A couple of years ago, I decided to write a book on risk, which seems pretty questionable this late period in life after I probably needed it decades ago. My old sergeant major and close friend Mike Hall used to say the greatest risk to the units we were in was me, and he was probably right. But you know, the question I always had was, if we know so much about risk, and all of us on this call have a lot of experience with it, why do we get it wrong so often? Why does it come out differently than we want it to? So I'd like to throw out a few thoughts today, and then we can have a conversation about it. When we think about risk, I go back to my childhood. My mother loved mythology and stories of history, and she used to give me books and tell me stories about people like this guy, Damocles. Now, Damocles was sort of a dissatisfied citizen in the kingdom of Dionysus. And he used to complain that he didn't get the privilege of the opportunities that the ruler did. So Dionysus got frustrated and brought him up to the palace, put him in a great seat, surrounded him with half-clad ladies. They brought fancy food and wine, and they said, okay, this is pretty good. And Damocles said, hey, nothing wrong with this. And then he looked up, and above him was a bronze sword hanging by a single horsehair. Now, Damocles at that moment knows that that's dangerous. It's a risk, but he doesn't know how strong the horsehair is or whether the sword, if it falls, is going to likely hurt him. So he's living with this constant risk. It's above him, and it is all-consuming. So he can't enjoy the wine, he can't enjoy the food, he can't enjoy being in the great place. And of course, Dionysus was trying to make the point, when you get in a position of power, it's tough. There are risks that are always there. Now, we're, most cases, not rulers, but we live with risk. We know it pretty well. Whether it's during a time in uniform or in business or in lives now, we know it. And the last couple of years, we've gotten to know it even better. And in many cases, it's become this consuming idea for us. Now, what is risk? I grew up thinking it was the intersection of the probability of something happening and the consequences if it does. If I climb up on the roof, what's the chance I'll fall off? And if I do fall, how badly will I get hurt? Now, if the probability of something happening went up, but the consequences stayed low, I didn't worry that much about it. Similarly, if the consequences go up, but if the probability stays low, again, I assume I won't be that unlucky minority that has it happen to them. But sometimes both the probability and the consequences go up. Then suddenly I pay attention, I start to plan, I buy insurance, I do all those mitigating things to take account that risk is there. There's a lot of scholarship on risk. You don't have to go very far to go find a book that says a lot about risk, gives you formulas and ways to deal with it. So it's not a case of not having the study or the history or the theory of risk. It's what we actually do about it. So the book we wrote, we have an ambitious title, A User's Guide, with the clear idea that every one of us is a user of risk, whether we want to be or not. For the last 2 years, we haven't wanted to be, but we've seen what happens to risk up close. A pandemic that has been theoretical to most of us for the earlier parts of life suddenly became very real. We studied up on the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919 and understood that we actually learned a lot more than 100 years ago about how to deal with a public health crisis. And then the polio epidemic of the 1950s was terrifying. The idea that young Americans were being put in iron lungs for the rest of their lives. And families lived with the horror of this happening. And so when the polio vaccine came, it was considered manna from heaven. And then more recent pandemics, which never got as big as we feared, but were frightening, some coming from Africa, really were specters in the back of our minds. We did a lot of planning. The United States was considered the most prepared nation in the world for something like a pandemic. And in 2019, the Department of Health and Human Services did a 4-part series of exercises, which they call Crimson Contagion. The scenario may sound familiar. An American traveled to China, flew back to Chicago not feeling well on the flight. When he arrived, his son picked him up at the airport. The son took him home so the traveler could go to bed, hopefully to feel better. The son went off to a rock concert, and subsequently 500,000 Americans died as the infection spread from the traveler through his son to many other people there. This was only months before the arrival of COVID-19. And yet the after-action report that came from Crimson Contagion had more than 70 pages of things that needed to be done, from equipment needed to coordination requirement to improve processes that largely were left undone. And we know that even though we were able to have a record time for producing a vaccine and distribute it to the population of the United States, in reality, instead of being a united, effective response to COVID-19, which is dangerous, but it's not 10 feet tall. It's not an unbeatable virus. Instead of being a united entity, you could say we fought it almost like 50 separate states. And even that would be an exaggeration. We more fought it like countless separate towns and cities and communities, none of which had sufficient resources or expertise to fight a pandemic on their own. This is a case like a defense. All of the pieces must fit together and everybody must do their job if you're going to have a successful outcome. And we know what it looks like when we don't do a good job of that. So the reality is the risk was less the threat than it was our vulnerability. So maybe we should define risk slightly differently. I think we have a risk problem. And I would argue that the greatest risk to us is actually us. It's not those things that come at us that are around the corner in the dark or waiting to pounce that are unexpected. It's our own inability or unwillingness to do some of the things we need to do to be prepared. If we go back to defining risk and we say instead of being at probability and consequences, think of it as a mathematical equation. And this is about the limit of my math. And you say threat times vulnerability equals risk. Now, if we're in a situation where there are no threats, we've got that wonderful situation where nothing's out there to get us, we actually have no risk because anything times 0 is 0. Similarly, even if there are lots of threats out there, if we are invulnerable, again, our risk is 0. But we never live in those situations. There are always threats that we're not very good at preventing or even predicting. And so it really comes down to that which we can control, which we have agency over. That's how vulnerable we are. which means what kind of a defense have we got? When I think of this, I immediately think of the human immune system. Now, many of us didn't think much about it until the arrival of COVID-19. We know more now. But we also know that we ingest about 10,000 microorganisms every day. And you say, okay, so what? Let me word it differently. We ingest 10,000 threats a day, any one of which could make us sick or kill us. Now we've got my attention. How do we deal with that? Well, we have a miracle defense system. The human immune system does 4 big things. It detects those things that we ingest. It assesses each of them on whether they're dangerous to us. It responds to those which must be destroyed. And it learns from it so it's better next time. So the 4 steps, detect, assess, respond, and learn, allow the human body to give us an incredible ability to fend off threats to us. And so most of us don't get up in the morning worried about our human immune system. We just assume it will work until we get sick. And when we get sick, it looks like this. When our human immune system isn't functioning. Now, if you're like me, that didn't mean much to you. But we know what it looks like when the human immune system doesn't work. We know the cost. We know the tragedy when we become vulnerable to things which we probably shouldn't be. So we have a risk problem. Now, if we think of this human immune system with its 4 essential capabilities, I would argue that that is also analogous to what we have in organizations, to ourselves and the rest of our lives, and our ability to deal with risk more broadly. We've essentially, regardless of the threat, we've got to detect, assess, respond, and learn. And so similarly, I think we have something that I'll call a risk immune system. And it's got 10 factors that make it up: narrative, structure, diversity, timing, adaptability, action, technology, bias, and they're connected, importantly, by communication. And then they're topped off by maybe the most important factor of leadership. Now, these 10 factors work together, and they never all have to be perfect. They just have to be functioning enough to give us the ability to have successful resilience against the threats that come. And what happens when our risk immune system is strong? Sometimes we get it right. And I take you to the city of Boston. At the beginning of COVID-19, the mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, knew he had a problem for which they were not prepared. Not that the city didn't have processes and contingency plans for different crises, but they hadn't been through a pandemic. So he started pulling out the plans and looking at what he needed to do to improve their ability to defend against the crisis. And what he understood quickly was he had to be decisive. He had to make hard decisions, sometimes before they were clearly needed by the population, so they were politically unpopular, like canceling the marathon and other events. But he made those decisions, difficulty, and he instituted some things to give him streamlined, intersected communications. What he knew is if you're not interconnected effectively, the whole organism as a community can't fight back, can't be effective, like a coherent defense. So he instituted something he called the Crisis Response Forum. And he brought the normal parts of government together every morning at 8 o'clock. And then he brought non-traditional stakeholders, universities, hospitals, food suppliers, because they're all part of the ecosystem of the city. And he connected them. And it had been normal times, he'd have gotten them all in a big room and they'd have been shoulder to shoulder and sorted things out. But you couldn't do that because of COVID. So they were operating from living rooms and kitchens. Many of the participants with teenagers over their shoulders showing them how to use Zoom. And he connected everybody. And every day he focused on what the situation was, what they had to do about it, who needed to talk, and how we had to solve that problem. Importantly, it became to operate almost like a human brain. Relationships that hadn't existed before suddenly were created. And the community started to solve the problem together. And he kept them focused on outcomes. And he famously ended every crisis response forum with a cheer that says, let's kick some ass today. Because we've got to take care of the people in this community who most need our help. You know, we have a risk problem, but I'll argue just as much as we have a risk problem, we have an opportunity. We decide how vulnerable we are. We decide how resilient we are. We're not only able to do that, we're responsible to do that. So let's talk about it. So thank you very much.
Well, great. Thanks for that great primer on a very useful topic and book. And now we get to our favorite part of the discussion, well, audience participation. And we have the pleasure of having you here for a little while to get into a little more in-depth discussion. And you and I were talking earlier, one of my frustrations while I was in the Army, though I loved being a soldier and serving the Army, was this issue of risk and sometimes this obsession with avoiding risk, which really meant you were just moving it versus identifying it and dealing with it. What's been your experience and ways to deal with that?
Yeah, and Dave, I've seen it in the Army, as you and I both did, but also in other corporate environments. What it really means is if a leader perceives that there is risk to their success or their reputation, or maybe the success of their part of the organization, often what they'll do is they'll make a decision not to do something that should be done. So for example, in the Army, it was often live fire training or very hard physical training because you're worried somebody might get hurt or get sick. And we all cared about the people that worked with us. We knew that the crucible of combat requires you to be very well trained and prepared. And if you make the decision to pull your punches, because it's less risk to your career, so you can send them into combat not as well prepared. What you've done is you've transferred your risk. You've moved it down the line. And soldiers are going to have to learn how to fight on the battlefield. And that's a very expensive place to learn what war's about.
Yeah, and so what happens even not in combat, like you said, you have moved risk to a point where the consequence is now worse and to a position of where people are less able to deal with it. And you give some great examples in the book.
The military's got a specific challenge because unlike businesses which work every day, they're sort of at war all the time. The military, except for the last 20 years when we were, but usually we have wars episodically. So in those periods of peacetime, there's this tendency to pull back from great realism for all of the reasons that we know are human. And yet what that does is it pulls us further and further by being truly prepared for what we have to do.
Well, let's go out to the audience because I know there are some great questions out there. One of them says, are you proposing that there's a different response than what had happened to stop COVID-19?
I am. I think that we could have done much better. If we look at COVID-19 and we say, what did we get wrong? Well, we got the science incredibly right. They created a vaccine faster than any time in human history, and they deployed it pretty darn quickly. Where I think we got wrong was very much early on. We started by not communicating well, and that includes no single person. The World Health Organization stumbled on that. The Chinese were not very forthcoming. Inside our own government, we didn't do it very well. We didn't establish a clear narrative. I would have used a wartime comparison, said we're in a war in which we've got to defend each of our fellow citizens. We've got to take care of the person on our left and right. And we've got to do those things, not that make us feel good, but provide security to people who aren't able to. I think we also could have made decisions earlier. In some cases, inertia overcame people. So there are a number of different aspects that I think we stumbled on. Now we've improved on many, but the reality is, I think much of the success of COVID-19 against the United States as a foe is our weakness. And if you compare us to other countries around the world, we don't stack up very impressively.
Well, here's a great question. What is the difference between risk management and consequence management?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah.
Really, risk management, I think they're not completely different.
Right.
Consequence management is what can you do to mitigate the effect of something happening or the impact of it happening. So if it happens, you wear body armor, so when you get shot, it won't have the same effect on you. Trying to reduce the risk often is also trying to avoid the risk by seeing it, detecting it, taking other actions, and also being strong enough that you just don't have the vulnerability of those risks in the first place.
Well, we knew it wouldn't be long till we get this question. Is defending Ukraine in the national interest? A little bit veering off topic, but there's risk involved.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's the question we should be asking right now. I think in the broadest sense, the unity of Western Europe and the United States, the West we'll call it, is critically important. And our unwillingness to do things that we have said are important, like support Ukraine, is important for our credibility, for our unity, and all of those things. Against this, however, you've got the reality that Vladimir Putin and many of the Russian people view Ukraine as an essential interest for them, really an existential threat. If Ukraine drifts toward the West, and God forbid in their eyes, we're even to become a part of NATO, which we're not talking about right now, but even if it just drifts west as it has been, then the viability of Russia in its traditional sense as a power in the region is undercut pretty significantly. So we are dealing with something that's extraordinarily important to them, but I would also argue is very, very important to the West. So I think it's a very important national interest right now.
Well, a lot of great questions, as we knew he would with this audience here. Another great sort of looking at things we deal with, not only in the military, but civilian world. What's the difference between a problem and risk? And then how do you allocate resources? How much of it goes to solving the problem versus how much of it goes to mitigating risk?
That's a great question. The risk idea is often, what are the costs if you do something? There are many things that if you have a military problem, you've got to go take a bridge, take a hill, secure an area. That is a problem. That's a task you've got, and it's got an outcome that you have to achieve. There are risks associated with that. One of them is not achieving that, and that's probably the greatest risk of all. If the mission is important, the biggest risk is if you don't achieve it. But there are risks to your force, there are risks to equipment, there are risks for reputation, all of those things. So sometimes how you do something creates risks or involves risks that we have to consider.
You know, sometimes people may not be good users of risk, haven't read your book, and can be wildly successful, sometimes in spite of something than because of it. And then you may sort of learn the wrong lesson from that. How do you sort of make sure that as you're going through, as you said, one of the steps is learn, you're learning the right lessons and not the wrong ones? Yeah,
there's a great way to think about this, and poker champion Annie Duke writes an awful lot about this, and she talks about probability-based decisions. And it's something I don't think we naturally do very well. There's a great case of a coach who makes a call to go for a 2-point conversion after a touchdown, and he could have had a tie. He went for a 2-point conversion for a win, and instead it failed and they lost the game. And we immediately say that was the stupidest decision ever. He took on a risk and he failed. Of course, had he been successful, people would be celebrating him. So what we have to do is sometimes we have to separate the outcome from how good the decision actually was. Just because you had a good outcome doesn't mean you made a good decision. You can just be absolutely lucky. Similarly, you can make the best decision possible and you can have a bad outcome. So this is where the concept of analyzing it after action reviews to understand actually what did happen. I've told people this when I wrote my memoirs after I retired. One of the great surprises was how little I knew about what had happened. There were cases where I was involved in an incident. I had assumed that I'd pulled the lever and this had been the outcome because of that. And then when I did more research and interviews, I found out all these other things happened. So me pulling the lever wasn't really very important. And I wasn't nearly as important in my memoirs as I thought I was. But it's important because if we simplify our analysis of outcomes, we derive conclusions that we say, okay, well that worked, so that will work next time. And that may be absolutely wrong.
So, you know, pulling the thread on this, in the Army, we all grew up with after action reviews. You discussed it in your book, you talked about it today, and the learning aspect. And so you go through that, and so you do a good assessment, and you're very critical of yourselves. You realize, okay, here's what we have to change. We've got to do better at this. Change in itself is risky. And as you've said many times, there's this inertia to change. And a lot of times when you start talking about changing, especially if it's a large organization, people are going to start bringing up all the risky things about the change. Well, what about this? What about this? What are some of the things you can do to overcome that inertia and say, you know, this change is based on our assessment of current risk?
Yeah, this is a leadership challenge that I think many leaders have got to take on, because the first thing you have to do is create a narrative where you can convince people that not changing carries risk in itself. Often, but it's risks they can't see. It's almost like violating doctrine. If someone follows Army doctrine and follows it perfectly, there's a certain sense of security in that. I did what General Perkins did in war, and it worked for him, and that was doctrinal, and therefore I won't be too badly criticized if it doesn't work. But the reality is, if it's stupid and it works, it ain't stupid. So the reality is, what we've got to do is be focused on outcomes. So sometimes, rather than staying where it has been trod before and it's safe, we've got to convince people that you've got to do something different. Now, convincing an organization where people also have their stakeholders there. If people build up expertise in certain things and you change it, the old "who moved my cheese," suddenly you take away a lot of their sense of self-worth, importance, and whatnot. So they'll fight bitterly to hold on to that.
So again, building upon this theme, so when we, as leaders, we want people to be long-term, hopefully thinking, and strategic in their view, and if they've gone through a lot of these processes you've talked about, they may start talking, hey, we have to change, here's some long-term strategic issues we've got to come to grips with, but in the short term, there are some downsides to it. And so by focusing on the long-term strategy, they may have to increase a short-term risk and even do some things that provide some immediate downsides but have a long-term benefit. How do you manage that, the long-term with the immediate cost of doing that?
Yeah, and that can be hard. I go back to a couple of things most of us are familiar with. The decision to wear body armor all the time in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there was guidance put out that said you will wear it, you'll report anyone who's a casualty, what they were wearing. Sometimes it's not appropriate. In the mountains of Afghanistan, it wasn't practical for someone to wear all that body armor if you're going to get to altitude and be able to fight. So leaders have got to make a decision knowing that there is some increased risk to one kind of threat, but there's a larger risk to not being able to get up the mountain and do the mission. Most, in my mind, the Operation Mushtarak in February 2010, going into the district of Marsh in Afghanistan, the division commander there brought up the term courageous restraint. And what he asked the soldiers to do was use less firepower, be more careful about how you engage so that we could protect the population. Now, in the near term, it would have been much safer for the soldiers to literally carpet bomb the area, move through behind armor, and solve the enemy problem. But the reality was, the big problem, we'd have done much greater damage to ourselves. So this is where rules of engagement, longer term leadership, this is where leaders have got to translate for people inside the force the importance of that linkage. I even found out that we had to do it during the wars for civilian supporting. I would get cards and letters and calls about not allowing elements of the force to use certain kinds of firepower because it would tie their hands, it would make them more vulnerable. But it also would cause us to lose the war. And people from afar, have to also be informed about, or at least our logic.
So you had that interesting graph in your discussion about consequence and probability. One of the questions from the audience here is how do you measure those? Because is it intuition? Is it gut instinct? Are there metrics associated with it?
Yeah, there are a million of metrics with it. And of course, you and I know you can create these matrices and you can put all kinds of information in them, and you can lull yourself into thinking that you have made something objective, which is very, very difficult to do. I spent a couple years on the board of Deutsche Bank USA. And here I am on the board of a major bank, and we would look at risk in incredible amount of detail. And we had all these models to look at the effect of interest rates, liquidity, and that sort of thing. And they're hard enough to understand for a banker, and for me, you can imagine. But then on the other side of the page, we had this list of risks like loss of talent, reputational loss. Those were existential risks to the bank. Those were the things that really would be cause for the bank to fail. And yet we spent a lot of time measuring the one, you look at the other, and sometimes you just sort of say, boy, it would be bad if those happened. and with much less comfort on how you measure them or what you do about them.
And so another question from the group out there. So we've talked a lot about risk to ourselves and how to identify it and how do we deal with it. I'll talk about a military combat point of view. Is there a way to add risk to the enemy versus just focusing on reducing our risk?
Yeah, I think that's the key idea of understanding that risk is opportunity. Sometimes if you take risk, go back to the principles of war, and you use economy of force in one place, so you accept some risk in part of your effort. We do it in budgeting, we do it in other things as well. So you can put sufficient capability or resources, mass, against a critical point. What you can do is you can put the enemy in a very difficult position. If you get any situation where somebody's trying to defend everything, or even a corporation's trying to touch every block so that they can compete in every part of the marketplace, almost inevitably they struggle with that. And so accepting some risk by not doing certain things so that you can focus on the things that matter most, it's what leaders are about, but it's also what allows an organization, I think, to have the best chance of success.
So we're talking about adding risk to the enemy. Conversely, so we're not far from the Pentagon where the budget fights go on daily in the E-ring, and it's all about budget and resources. When you look at DoD, are there priorities that you think DoD should focus on to reduce our vulnerability as our ability to defend ourselves?
And I'll be quite honest, I am not read into it enough now to speak with other than a tremendous amount of humility on that. I will say I am a believer that at the end of the day, talent is everything. Mm-hmm. If we get the people right, we'll solve any problem. Not independent of equipment entirely, but largely independent. And so I would say that whenever we have to default, if we spend money on people, we're going to get a good outcome.
We'll come back to these Ukraine questions. Mm-hmm. So when we spoke about Ukraine, we talked about the relationship with Russia and how they view the world and our leverage there. How do you think that's going to impact what happens or doesn't happen with regards to China and then Russia and us, kind of balancing that three-legged stool?
Yeah, this is Stan, not Henry Kissinger here.
Right.
I think an awful lot about this and spoke to a real China expert last night at length, but I think we have to look at the world completely now, as a chessboard if you want to. And the reality is I believe that if we are ineffective in Ukraine, it will have an effect on our relations with China in a negative way. I'm not saying that it will cause China to attack Taiwan or not, but I will say that if we are credible in the crisis with Ukraine, if we show resolve, if we show coherent, competent governance inside the United States, and then effective unified foreign policy outside, then I think our ability to operate vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis any opponent ratchets up tremendously. Any autocratic dictator, would-be power broker in the world takes advantage of disunity and people who are unable to make decisive decisions. We look at Hitler's early years. He really took advantage of the fact that Europe was terrified of a second world war. If we can show enough strength, I think we reduce our risk significantly.
So again, in one of your Venn diagrams there, leadership was at the center, which I agree with you. In any organization it is. And so an aspect of leadership is what decisions are made where and who has what authority. And in great organizations like you've led and we've all been a part of, we really try to empower our subordinates as much as possible. So that's pushing decisions down to the appropriate level. When you look at risk management, how do you come to those decisions about who's allowed to take how much risk and then who's allowed to pass it on, and how do you inculcate your organization to understand that?
Yeah. Traditionally, we would raise risk to a level that if the impact was going to be beyond the entity that the level it was being made at, then you ratcheted the risk decision up. So for example, a corporation would say you can't spend more, you can't make a money decision more than a certain amount because that would affect the larger corporation. We're in a world now where we talk about the strategic corporal or things which happen at a much lower level having an outsized impact because of information technology and whatnot. So nowadays, I don't think it can be that sterile anymore. I don't think you can say this level this level this. I think you've got to, the commander's intent idea, tell people we're trying to push as many decisions down, but you must have the contextual understanding. Shared consciousness is a term that we use. Push down to those people so that as they make those decisions, as I think is appropriate, they understand far more about the big picture than they used to. When we were lieutenants, we were sort of told, point this way, worry about this, don't worry about what's on your left and right. And the reality is, nowadays, we've got to push that down to lower level decision makers. And they will make some mistakes, but they'll, in aggregate, we'll get a better outcome because it'll be closer to the point of action.
Well, speaking about when you and I were lieutenants, which back literally in the dark ages, we came into the Army during the Cold War. And there were pictures in your book of we were doing war games, and we'd do these things called correlation of forces. Yeah. How many tanks the Soviets have, how many do we have, rags and dags and all that. And you'd go through really almost a mathematical battlefield calculus. We literally use that term to weigh the pluses and minuses. In the current threats we face now, it's not so clear cut how many tanks, how many artillery, all that, this battlefield calculus. So how do you start computing risk in this hybrid world with misinformation, cyber, all these things that don't lend themselves to these, like you said, these charts and order of battles that you and I grew up with?
Yeah. I mean, quite honestly, I'm not sure any of us knows the answer to that question, because some of the technologies which have emerged, like disinformation, the ability to leverage information technology to create disinformation, has a leveraged effect. If you can convince a population to believe something that isn't so, then you can get the entire, it's a head fake on a national level or on a global level, and you can get people going one way when it would be better for them if they went the other way. So I think it's more powerful than nuclear weapons. I think, in fact, it is the ability to change the dynamic of interaction for a limited period of time, in any case, but often that's enough. And so reducing that risk really is something we haven't come to grips with yet, because we're partly the architects of it in our own social media systems. I think social media is more powerful than we know how to deal with yet. We're not a mature enough society to deal effectively with it. And similarly, cyber attacks. I think we could create cyber damage and upset that would cause almost any society to freeze up almost immediately. And so if we think about the impact of there's been no weapon in history as powerful as those two. So now we've got to step back and say, all right, they also are not weapons that are limited to nation states. You could get certain smaller non-state actors doing that. So we've got to take a look at our society and say, how are we going to survive that? How do we make ourselves less vulnerable, more resilient to that? Because it will by definition happen. There are going to be, we've had a lot of cyber activity, but we haven't had the level of cyber attacks that people are capable of prosecuting yet. Similarly, we haven't had disinformation. We've had elections be impacted, but we haven't yet had an attack on a candidate on a Sunday that creates so much doubt that on Tuesday when people go to vote, people are impacted by that. And then we find out Wednesday it's totally false. We've got to get our mind around how we create systems that take that reality or that potential into account.
You know, we experience every day, we see it on the news, you can see it in polling. Unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of division in our country. We're very divided. It causes a lot of us to have concern. Your map on the COVID thing, first you show the country, then it's 50 states, but it's really counties, towns, and this. Aside from the COVID aspect of it, what kind of risk is that division that we see in our country for any number of reasons, you know, increasing our vulnerability to any number of threats?
I think it is extraordinarily risky, dangerous to us. I'm doing a lot of reading on the years before the Civil War now. I've become very interested, and I'm reading Carl Sandburg's 6 volumes of Abraham Lincoln. And I've just got past the Battle of Antietam, and he's preparing to do the Emancipation Proclamation. But the part that comes out is, first, slavery, and we all have opinions on how terrible that was. It was an economic issue against free labor or paid labor. And then it moved into, really with Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, it suddenly became a popular moral issue. And then it became a cultural issue. And so we got the last few years before the Civil War, the North and South got to the point where there was this level of distrust and hatred that had become tribal. And it feels like we've got the rumblings of that kind of division growing in America right now. We don't have a single issue like the economics of North and South or slavery and non-slavery that we did then, but we've got this cultural idea that they are bad people because they're not me. And I don't know how we step back from that. We have got to get away where we come back to those things we agree upon. And some of which we agree upon has got to be sources of information that are legitimate and credible, and that we agree are legitimate and credible, almost in the middle, that we do. Because absent that, I don't think we've been in this uncharted territory before.
You know, it's always easy to Monday morning quarterback anything. In fact, if you listen to the sports talk shows on Monday morning, there's all kinds of Monday morning quarterbacking going on. In the process of doing the ARs, if you want to call it Monday morning quarterbacking, how do you guard against making sure you're getting all the information and not just the information that reinforces your predisposed decision of what you think really happened? We tend to filter our own information.
I mean, we're all guilty. You write your memoirs, you start with an idea of how you wish history had been, and then you try to go find things that say how it was. I think that happens with investigations. I think that happens with after-action reviews. I think that happens with histories. And if you look at different histories written of the same period, they reflect not just the period they're studying, but the period in which they are written. They have a certain bias to them that takes them in one direction or another. And the further you get away, the more people are using second and third order resources, not going back to first sources. So I think you've got to get some way to almost red team the conclusions you're making. An after-action review is designed to have the red team aspect built into it because it brings different parts in and it's supposed to reach certain conclusions. But I almost think we need to red team our process because it's so sacred, because if you walk out of something like a review of an operation or an after-action review of something and say, this is what happened and this is what it means and this is what we're going to do about it, and you get that wrong, you make big decisions. And at an Army level, you make procurement decisions, you make training decisions, you make all kinds of things that may in fact be well off azimuth.
Well, unfortunately, we've come to the point where we have one official last question. And since I got to ask the first official question, I'll ask the last one. And
Sure.
You and I were talking about this beforehand. It's a little bit, we're talking red team. You know, in the military, a very hierarchical organization, we wear our position on our uniform, rank, merit badges, et cetera, like that. And how we interface with people is dramatically affected by that. Yet there could be people maybe on the backbench or don't have the right merit badges that really have that critical piece of information. As a leader, how do you make sure you've empowered everybody to know that they can come to you with information that maybe you don't want to know, but that you need to know?
Yeah. You told a great story as we talked before this about wearing your driver's uniform because your uniform was dirty, and interfacing with someone who didn't know you, came in and you're briefing them about brigade level operations wearing a specialist uniform and how they responded to you a certain way because that's the lens through which they saw you. They probably thought either this brigade is amazing, got an E4 running it, or this is an amazing E4, but the reality is that's a good reminder. So I think that the first thing we need to understand is just if we tell people, you can come to me anytime, I have an open door policy, doesn't mean people will come through the open door. If people ask you if you walk around and talk to soldiers, and we all remember this, and you talk to a young private and say, how you doing? And you're kind of moving along because you're an energetic senior leader, they'll go, fine, sir. And you walk on and you say, hey, the privates are fine. If you stop and you sit down and you say, how you doing? They go, fine, sir. Because that's what they think you want to hear. And then you say, well, what would you do differently if you were in my job? And you convince them you really want to know. And this is when you really got to look at them and convince them you want to know. Mike Hall used to tell me, if you're not writing stuff down, when they're talking, you or somebody with you is not writing it down, you're not prepared to act on it, then they quickly know that this was just a courteous thing. So I think it is creating that understanding that when you ask something, you want to know the answer. And if you get an answer you don't like, you are going to go further. You're going to find out if that's correct. You're going to fix it if it's broken. If it's not broken, you're at least going to take that in as important data. And that's a responsibility that as you get more senior, it's easy to forget. Because as we talked, as you get more senior, you get smarter, you get funnier, you get more handsome, you get all of those things. And you start to forget that you ain't. None of them.
Until you retire.
That's right. That's true.
Hey, sir. Well, thanks so much for coming
Dave.
out here today. I feel like I got a PhD course in leadership and risk. Thanks for not only spending here time today, but continue to help our men and women who serve our nation by, very succinctly giving advantage of your SCAR teacher learning. So we appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much.
General, back to you.
Well, thank you, General Perkins, General McChrystal. Before we close, I'd like to inform you of a few upcoming events. On 15 February, we'll host a noon report on Warrant Officer Talent Management, featuring CW5 Richard Knowlton, Senior Warrant Officer Advisor for the Army Talent Management Task Force, CW5 Teresa Domier, Command Chief Warrant Officer, Army National Guard, and CW5 Patrick Nelligan, Command Chief Warrant Officer, U.S. Army Reserve. This is moderated by CW5 Phyllis Wilson, U.S. Army retired, and our own AUSA Senior Fellow. On the 8th of March, we will host Coffee with the Chief, featuring General James C. McConville, held at the National Museum of the United States Army, Fort Belvoir, Virginia. I hope you can join us for an upcoming webinar. For more information about any of these events, or to register, please visit our website at ausa.org. Finally, we want to thank all of you who support us with your membership. Membership matters. You help us provide a voice for the Army and support soldiers, veterans, civilians, and their families. Thank you again for attending, and have a great Army Day.